2023. Under international law, the Gaza Strip is occupied territory. Gaza is also one of the most densely populated places on Earth. For over 4 months now, and after enduring 17 years of blockade, its population of over 2.2 million has been under siege, faced with severe restrictions on water, food, and other essential goods. The level of human suffering faced by civilians in Gaza, predominantly women and children, is on a scale seldom seen in the modern era. Israel's indiscriminate attacks on the Gaza Strip have caused massive civilian casualties and the extensive destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals. Some 75% of Gaza's total population is displaced. I note here, Mr. President, the latest orders issued to the Israeli Defense Forces to plan for the evacuation of Rafah ahead of another military offensive. That offensive would leave the approximately 1.5 million displaced Gazans taking refuge in the city with nowhere to go. These plans have been met with the international community's resounding rejection. Israel has imposed a policy of collective punishment against the Palestinian people in violation of Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel has repeatedly issued so-called evacuation orders that in effect seek to transfer Palestinians forcibly in violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel has also failed its duty of ensuring the food and medical supplies of the population in Gaza in violation of Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel has further failed to protect the wounded and the sick in violation of Article 16 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Each passing day is met with further violations of international humanitarian law. And while the eyes of the world are trained on its brutal military operation in Gaza, Israel's violations in the West Bank have intensified. As submitted to the court, a number of Israeli acts in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, constitute grave breaches under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel's conduct also violates the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, which lies at the heart of these proceedings. 2023 was by far the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since the United Nations began keeping records, more than tripling the previous high in 2022. 2023 also saw the highest levels of settler violence yet recorded by the United Nations. The freedom of movement of Palestinians has been severely impacted, including for Palestinian farmers seeking to harvest their lands in the West Bank. Demolitions of Palestinian property have also reached their highest levels. This puts into stark relief the magnitude of this latest iteration of the Israeli settlement enterprise that erodes key components of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, including the denial of access to ancestral lands and control over natural resources. In addition, there has been an intensification of Israeli settlement construction that undermines the viability of the two-state solution. According to the Secretary General, 2023 saw the highest reported level of Israeli approvals and support for settler housing in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I raise these recent developments to underline that the violations at the core of the questions posed by the General Assembly are not static. After decades of violent dehumanization, dispossession, and despair, the breaches resulting from the Israeli occupation in all parts of the occupied Palestinian territory are worsening at an alarming pace. I will now focus on Israel's long-standing violations in East Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city of unique cultural and religious depth and texture that has occupied, through history, a place at the crossroads of cultures and civilizations. The city of Jerusalem has the unique feature of being sacred for all 3 Abrahamic religions and is home to a host of holy places. This feature has put a special imprint on the city's character, and the international community has accordingly underlined the need to preserve Jerusalem's unique spiritual and religious dimensions. If Jerusalem has, throughout its long history, represented one thing, it is tolerance. In the words of UNESCO, more than any other place in the world, Jerusalem embodies the hope and dream of dialogue between cultures, civilizations, and spiritual traditions, a dialogue through which mutual understanding between peoples may flourish. Such is the unique historical nature of Jerusalem that an Israeli official once cautioned that anyone depriving Jerusalem of these contrasts, anyone upsetting the equilibrium by trying to make one factor predominant over another, would make Jerusalem cease to be herself. Jerusalem is a place of enormous significance to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. On account of their artistic, religious, and historical value, the Old City and the holy places are of exceptional importance to all humanity. Jerusalem's unique character has given rise to specific legal obligations as regards the rights of religious communities, including specific guarantees of access to the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic holy places. Since 1757, it has been the case that whoever holds Jerusalem is bound by this legal and historic status quo. As early as 1948, the Security Council urged all governments and authorities concerned to take every possible precaution for the protection of the holy places and of the city of Jerusalem, including access to all shrines and sanctuaries for the purposes of worship. The concerns that motivated the Council then still remain. In 2023, the Security Council called for upholding unchanged the historic status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem, in word and in practice. Israel has, in agreements with Jordan and with the Holy See, committed to the historic status quo and freedom of access to the holy places in Jerusalem. In the Wall opinion, the court relied on such bilateral agreements, observing that they were part of the specific guarantees of access to holy places. It is therefore gravely disconcerting that Israel has taken and continues to take measures which undermine the special character of Jerusalem and erase its cultural heritage. Israel is in breach of its obligations by repeatedly interfering with the holy places and hindering freedom of access to them. Since the start of the occupation in 1967, Muslims and Christians have been impeded from worshipping at their holiest sites. Also in breach of the historic status quo are Israel's excavations in Jerusalem. Excavations and tunneling, particularly in and around the Old City, imperil its historical, cultural, and religious character. The works are carried out despite the serious risks to the integrity of Muslim and Christian holy places. The General Assembly has determined that these acts are flagrant violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Turning to the question of settlements, the ring settlements in East Jerusalem contribute to the further isolation of the city from the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. They thereby undermine the viability of East Jerusalem as the capital of an independent Palestinian state. This is fast becoming a fait accompli. Mr. President, Israel's measures to extend its administration and laws to East Jerusalem are inconsistent with the most fundamental tenets of the law of occupation and the right to self-determination. Indeed, Israel's administration of East Jerusalem constitutes annexation of territory on which the Palestinian people have the right to self-determination. International law is unequivocal in this respect. All measures by Israel that affect or aim to alter the status of East Jerusalem are null and void and have no legal effect on its status. By Resolution 478 of 1980, the Security Council affirmed that Israel's enactment of the Basic Law was a violation of international law. Resolution 478 was plainly intended to be legally binding on Israel and all UN member states. A binding determination by the Security Council to the effect that a situation is illegal must have consequences. As the court noted in the Namibia opinion, it would be failing in the discharge of its judicial functions if it did not declare that there is an obligation to bring such a situation to an end. Israel's violations in East Jerusalem and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory threaten the viability of the two-state solution and go to the very nature of the occupation. It is in this context that I come to the legality of the occupation itself. The Security Council reaffirmed in 1980 the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories occupied by Israel since 1967. The General Assembly has declared that the Arab territories occupied since 1967 have continued to be under illegal Israeli occupation. Israel's occupation is, as the vast majority of participants in these proceedings have recognized, illegal and must end. Israel's occupation breaches the requirement under the law of occupation that an occupation must be temporary and cannot become permanent. It is in breach of the cardinal principle enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible. Israel's occupation, furthermore, violates peremptory norms of general international law, such as the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Mr. President, whether the illegality of Israel's occupation is determined under general international law or under the Charter, the conclusion is the same. It is illegal. Israel's illegal acts cannot remain without consequence, which takes me to my last point. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Court, I will now address the legal consequences of the ongoing violations by Israel. I wish to draw the Court's attention to the obligations identified by the Court in the Chagos and Wall opinions. First, Israel has, inter alia, an obligation to comply with the primary obligations it has breached, an obligation to ensure cessation of those breaches, and an obligation to make reparation for the damage caused by those breaches. Let me illustrate these obligations with a few examples. This means that Israel must cease all policies and practices impeding the exercise of the Palestinian right to self-determination, and repeal all laws and regulations that aim to alter the demographic composition, character, and status of East Jerusalem. It also means that Israel must ensure freedom of access to the holy places and respect the legal and historic status quo. This means that Israel must comply with all its obligations as the occupying power in the occupied Palestinian territory in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. For example, Israel must bring into the Gaza Strip the necessary food and medical supplies to the Palestinian population, and it must end its siege and all practices depriving Palestinians of supplies essential to their survival. In practical terms, it must mean a ceasefire. It also means that Israel must stop its so-called evacuation orders and forcible transfers of Palestinians. It means that Israel must dismantle settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory and must prevent violence perpetrated by settlers, many of them armed, against Palestinians. And it means that Israel must put an end to its settlement activities, its confiscation of land, demolition of homes, and the transfer of new Israeli settlers to the occupied Palestinian territory. Finally, Israel must also comply with all decisions of the Security Council, in line with Article 25 of the UN Charter. This includes the binding decisions in Resolutions 478, 2334, 2712, and 2720. The UAE further submits that the erga omnes and jus cogens character of norms violated by Israel also give rise to obligations for all states. First, no state may recognize as lawful the situation resulting from Israel's unlawful conduct, nor render assistance to maintain such a situation. Second, states are under an obligation to cooperate to bring to an end Israel's serious breaches. Additionally, state parties to the Geneva Conventions must ensure respect for those conventions. These obligations may translate into different actions from one state to another. The UAE believes that diplomatic engagement and dialogue can be effective tools to encourage compliance and cessation of unlawful conduct. But where these tools fail, third states' obligations remain, as do the other instruments of the international system, including the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the court that sits in this great hall of justice. As the permanent representative of a country that has just completed its term on the Security Council, I wish to invite the court to consider the following. The obligations to cooperate and to ensure respect for international law carry implications for states in the exercise of their vote on the Security Council. Voting against or preventing the adoption of a Security Council resolution that seeks to put an end to serious breaches of international law cannot be compatible with such obligations. Israel's violations also have implications for international organizations. The organs of the United Nations can and should take all steps within their respective mandates with a view to ensuring an end to those violations. The UAE remains firmly committed to play its part in supporting the principles of international law which underpin the international system. The UAE considers that the court's advice on the questions before it is critical. Indeed, we believe it matters for all states, large and small, who rely upon and seek to preserve our international order. The reason it matters is quite simple. The even-handed application of international law is essential if that order is to function. To allow otherwise, to permit states to pick and choose what international law to apply and when, risks destabilizing our international order. Mr. President, distinguished members of the court, the Palestinian people have suffered for far too long under an occupation that is seemingly immune from international law. Palestinians and Israelis deserve to thrive side by side in their own independent, prosperous, and secure states. This cannot happen if Israel's violations persist. Peace will remain elusive while the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination continues to be denied. The UAE has every confidence that the court's opinion will contribute significantly towards achieving a peaceful resolution of this conflict in accordance with international law. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of the United Arab Emirates for its presentation. I invite the next participating delegation, the United States of America, to address the court. I call upon Mr. Richard Vizek to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of the court. I am honored to appear before you today on behalf of the United States of America. The court has a serious and difficult task before it. In the time since the General Assembly first requested this advisory opinion, the international community has confronted the horror of the terrorist attacks of October 7, including the taking of hostages who have yet to be released, and the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, which has had severe, widespread, and tragic consequences for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Violence, including extremist settler violence, also surged in the West Bank. The United States, along with others, is engaging intensively with the Palestinians, with Israel, and with other states in the region and within the United Nations, not only to address the current crisis, but to get beyond where we have been, namely to advance a political settlement that will lead to a durable peace in the region that includes lasting security for Israelis and Palestinians and a path to Palestinian statehood. The Security Council and the General Assembly remain convinced that the Israelis and Palestinians must take the steps necessary to resolve their conflict and create such an enduring peace. These principal organs of the United Nations have laid out and continue to endorse the path to achieve that peace through the principles first articulated in Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Those resolutions are the core of the established framework within which the Court should address the legal questions before it. This Court's advisory opinion will have consequences for the parties to the conflict and for the ongoing efforts of all of those working to achieve a durable peace. It will do so for the Security Council, which bears primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security. It will do so for the General Assembly, which requested the Court's advice. And it will do so for the other members of the international community. Throughout the tumultuous and often violent history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the United Nations has been consistent in its support for the proposition that a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace requires negotiations between the parties to the conflict. As the Court can see in the submissions before it, there is broad international support for achieving a negotiated solution to the conflict that will give rise to a Palestinian state, a solution in which two peoples live side by side with equal measures of freedom, security, opportunity, and dignity, and which results in broader regional integration and stability with respect for the right of all states to live in peace within secure and recognized borders. It is for these reasons that the United States encourages the Court to ensure that its opinion preserves and promotes the established framework and the prerogatives of the principal political organs of the United Nations to identify the appropriate measures to address this particular matter of international peace and security. Mr. President, members of the Court, it will not be possible in this statement to address every assertion or underlying assumption, including those with which the United States disagrees. Instead, my statement today will proceed in two parts. First, I will discuss the established framework set forth and endorsed by the Security Council and the General Assembly, as well as the widespread recognition that the parties must return to that framework as the pathway to durable peace. I will then address guiding considerations for the important role the Court should play in preserving and promoting that framework. Mr. President, members of the Court, the first time the General Assembly sought this Court's advice in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Court recognized that, and I quote, "This tragic situation can be brought to an end only through implementation in good faith of all relevant Security Council resolutions, in particular resolutions 242 adopted in 1967 and 338 adopted in 1973. This statement remains as true today as it was then, as the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the international community have consistently affirmed, and as many of the submissions in these proceedings recognize. As set out in our written submissions, the established framework for achieving a comprehensive and enduring peace is anchored in Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. At their core, these and subsequent resolutions call for the application of two interdependent and inseparable requirements for a just and lasting peace. One is the withdrawal of forces from occupied territory, and the other is peace and security for states in the Middle East through acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area. In identifying these interdependent requirements, the Security Council decided that the withdrawal of Israeli forces relies on and is bound together with the termination of belligerency, mutual recognition and respect for the right of Israel and every other state in the region to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. This principle is referred to by both the Security Council and the General Assembly as land for peace. In the years since, these interdependent and inseparable requirements have been the organizing principle of historic peace agreements, first between Israel and Egypt, and then between Israel and Jordan. They were also adopted by Israel and the Palestinians in the Oslo Accords, though the promise of Oslo has yet to be fulfilled. The framework built upon these requirements remains the only basis for achieving a comprehensive peace in the region and between the parties. The Security Council and the General Assembly have reflected this time and again in their respective resolutions. This framework also remains the basis for ongoing U.S. efforts to facilitate a lasting peace. Earlier this month, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken traveled to the region for the 5th time since October 7 and discussed the sets of commitments that all parties would need to make. As he explained, there will be difficult choices necessary to realize the vision of the long elusive prospect of true peace and true security. He also reinforced that the diplomatic path to a just and lasting peace and to true security for all in the region continues to be a path to an Israel that is fully integrated into the region with normal relations with the countries of the region and with firm guarantees for its security. He underscored that this must include a concrete path to a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. The United States is not alone in this effort to achieve and sustain the goal of the established framework that the Security Council and the General Assembly have created and continue to endorse. Countries and organizations around the world, some of which are participating in these proceedings, continue to reiterate the imperative of reviving the peace process and urgently achieving a two-state solution. Our written comments collect a number of statements made to that effect. Mr. President, members of the Court, I turn now to the second part of my statement and the important role the Court can play in preserving and promoting this established framework. The Court has appropriately recognized that its role in rendering an advisory opinion is to assist the requesting UN organ while taking care to avoid a result that could undermine the determinations of the Security Council and its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. This feature of the Court's advisory function has several important implications for the Court's work in this proceeding. I will discuss 3 of them. First and fundamentally, the Court should not take up the suggestion of some to interpret the questions in this proceeding as encompassing the entire question of Palestine. The request seeks advice only with respect to the legal consequences of the conduct of one of the parties to the underlying conflict. This one-sidedness, which contrasts with the reciprocity inherent in the established framework, necessarily must inform the Court's approach to this advisory proceeding. Second, contrary to the assertions of some participants, in calling for the Court to take this measured approach to the question referred, the United States is by no means suggesting there is no role for the Court, nor is it the position of the United States that the Court must refrain from considering violations of international law or the legal consequences thereof. Participants who have said as much have misunderstood us. Our argument is grounded in respect for the UN Charter and the roles and responsibilities assigned to the UN's principal organs. The Court's advisory function was designed to assist the UN's principal political organs in the proper performance of their respective functions. In exercising its advisory role, the Court must necessarily consider the extent to which the Security Council and General Assembly have taken action to address the matter of international peace and security, particularly where, as here, they have directly and repeatedly endorsed a specific framework for achieving peace. None of the Security Council's resolutions have suggested altering or departing from this framework. In fact, as recently as late December, the Council, in Resolution 2720, reiterated its, and I quote, unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions, end quote. And at around the same time, the General Assembly likewise stressed in Resolution 78/192, quote, the urgency of achieving without delay an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace settlement between the Palestinian and Israeli sides, based on the relevant resolutions of the United Nations, the Madrid Terms of Reference, including the principles of land for peace, the Arab Peace Initiative, and the Quartet Roadmap to a permanent two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. International law has a central and important role to play here. Within the established framework, the Security Council itself, including in recent resolutions 2172 and 2720, has demanded that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. And within the framework, the Council has also sought to remove obstacles to the achievement of a two-state solution, including the establishment of civilian settlements, destruction of infrastructure, demolition of homes, and the failure to prevent acts of terrorism. The Council has likewise emphasized that the parties should be held to their commitments. For example, Security Council Resolution 1850 notes the irreversibility of the bilateral negotiations between the parties and urges, and I quote, an intensification of diplomatic efforts to foster in parallel with progress in the bilateral process, mutual recognition and peaceful coexistence between all states in the region in the context of achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. In any consideration by the Court of these or other issues, the challenge for the Court is how to provide its advice in a way that promotes the framework rather than disrupting its balance, potentially making the possibility of negotiations even more difficult. In this regard, it would not, as some participants suggest, be conducive to achievement of the established framework to issue an opinion that calls for a unilateral, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal by Israel that does not account for Israel's legitimate security needs. Whatever the Court's opinion on the legal consequences of particular violations of international law, such an outcome would be contrary to the established framework, which the Security Council and General Assembly have structured around the two interdependent and inseparable elements, not only withdrawal, but also the conditions necessary for peace and security for all states in the region. An enduring peace requires progress on both of these balanced elements. In addition, as noted in the U.S. written comments, the establishment of this framework by the Security Council and General Assembly is a salient feature of these proceedings, distinguishing it from other proceedings. Mr. President, members of the court, as Secretary General Guterres remarked just a few weeks ago in connection with ending Israel's occupation, quote, "A lasting end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only come through a two-state solution. Israelis must see their legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see their legitimate aspirations for a fully independent, viable, and sovereign state realized, in line with the United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements." Under the established framework, any movement towards Israel's withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza requires consideration of Israel's very real security needs. We were all reminded of those security needs on October 7, and they persist. Regrettably, those needs have been ignored by many of the participants in asserting how the court should consider the questions before it. In sum, it is important that the court keep in mind the balance that the Security Council and General Assembly have determined is necessary to provide the best chance for durable peace. Mr. President, members of the court, I turn now to my third point. In carefully considering how its advice might best support progress within the established framework, the court should not deviate from longstanding principles of international law, including with respect to the law of belligerent occupation. As set out in the written submissions of the United States, international law does not provide for an occupation itself to be rendered unlawful or void, based either on its duration or on any violations of occupation law. Under international humanitarian law, a belligerent occupation is established when the customary international law standard reflected in Article 42 of the Hague IV regulations is satisfied. The fact of an occupation is the basis for the occupying power to exercise its authority over occupied territory. The fact of an occupation is also the basis for the application of the legal rights and duties applicable to an occupying power. For example, the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits an occupying power from transferring parts of its own civilian population into territory it occupies. Even if an occupying power violates such a prohibition, as has been argued in this proceeding and as the court found in construction of a wall, the legal status of the occupation would not change as a consequence, because the occupation continues in fact. Importantly, this means that the protections of occupation law, including its protections for civilians, would continue to apply. We were surprised to hear that some have questioned in this proceeding the U.S. position on the illegality of acquisition of territory by the use of force. We have repeatedly stated our strong opposition to any unilateral attempts to change the peacefully established status of territories by force or coercion anywhere in the world, and have reaffirmed that the acquisition of territory by force is prohibited. And as our written statement made clear in reference to this and other situations, the Security Council and the General Assembly have declared that any actions to change the status of occupied territory are null and void and do not affect the continued application of the Fourth Geneva Convention. With respect to duration, international law does not impose specific time limits on an occupation. That said, belligerent occupation is a temporary measure for administering territory under the control of belligerent armed forces. A few days ago at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary Blinken emphasized that it is more urgent than ever to proceed to a Palestinian state, one that also ensures the security of Israel and makes the necessary commitments to do so. In light of these considerations, the court should not find that Israel is legally obligated to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from occupied territory. The court can address the questions before it within the established framework based on the Land for Peace principle and within the parameters of established principles of occupation law. Mr. President, members of the court, as I said at the outset, you have a difficult task before you. Others have asked you to broadly construe the questions and the law. They have asked you to try to resolve the whole of the dispute between the parties through an advisory opinion addressed to questions focusing on the acts of only one party. The United States disagrees with that this approach would be consistent with the court's role within the United Nations or the established UN framework for achieving peace through negotiations. Hamas's attacks, hostage-taking, and other atrocities, the ongoing hostilities and the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, and the violence in the West Bank reinforce the United States' resolve to urgently achieve a final peace that includes the full realization of Palestinian self-determination. The current crisis illustrates the vital need to achieve this peace, this final peace, with a Palestinian state living safely and securely alongside a secure Israel, fully integrated into the region. As Secretary Blinken said, quote, "We're not going to have durable security for Israel unless and until Palestinian political aspirations are met," end quote. The lack of meaningful progress on a negotiated end to the conflict and establishment of peace between the parties and for the region cannot and must not persist. The Security Council and General Assembly continue to make clear their support for the two-state solution and the established framework to fulfill it. This conflict cannot be resolved through violence or unilateral actions. Negotiations are the path to lasting peace. For these reasons, we respectfully encourage the court to carefully calibrate its advice in this proceeding to support and promote final realization of peace and stability within the established UN framework set out in Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. Mr. President, members of the court, this concludes the oral statement of the United States. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the delegation of the United States of America for its presentation, which brings to a close this morning's hearing. The court will meet again this afternoon at 3 p.m. to hear the Russian Federation, France, the Gambia, Guyana, and Hungary. The sitting is adjourned.